Confusion, helplessness, air and skies thick with pollution. Controls, saviors and miracle cures, problem, reaction, solution. Hate, division, infotainment, blame, anger, incitement. Someone's always selling it. Are you smelling it? Nukes, dinosaurs, monkeys swinging from family trees, spinning water ball viruses and domestic terrorists to put us on our knees. Polio, COVID, STDs, get far away if you're gonna sneeze. By way of deception, they wage their war. Who says we have to take it anymore?
Oh, so classic. We are having so much fun with this new AI software introduced to us by Agent 131711, composing some truth songs. That's just our first salvo in this space. Welcome everyone to episode 39 of Reframing the Narrative. How do you not get energized after hearing that song? But yes, Jake, good to see you as always. And I know that you've got some initial thoughts to tee this conversation off, so I'm going to hand the mic right over to you.
Thanks, PJ. I enjoyed listening to that song with you, and it couldn't have come out any better. I'm so excited. It was so much fun. I played it for some kind of like-minded friends, and they not only crack up, but it's poignant and it hits home, and it's punctuated by some humor, like the female background voice that comes out and goes, "Dinosaurs." It's just too funny. So speaking of Agent 131711, we're going to try something in the coming months where we kind of riff on some of the work of Agent 131711. And that's a Substack author, friend of the podcast. Hopefully he thinks of us as a friend of his stack as well. And he's also the co-owner and curator of something called the Shadow Band Library with Medicine Girl, also a friend of the podcast, Robin. So there's some really great resources out there. And Agent, to be honest, he pumps out such good material at such a rate that it's hard to keep up sometimes. So what we're going to do is, for the first episode of each month, we're kind of going to take either a specific article or kind of a theme that Agent has been riffing on, has been delving into. Let's just say the topic of supplements and vitamins, and we'll break that down. But we're not here to really represent Agent and interpret the work. We're using it as a springboard for a conversation, as a touchstone, so to speak. So I thought for this particular episode, we might look into the way Agent kind of goes behind the veil of stories that were told. And the way these stories are told is to give us almost like a cloud of confusion, just like a shotgun bird shot goes out, right? It's just this burst of all these things that were told, but they're all out of the same barrel of something that is the non-negotiable truth or the non-negotiable premise. And an example of that would be, taking a recent topic, Charlie Kirk was assassinated in Utah. Another example would be there's a killer virus on the prowl and it's going global. And so working from that premise, the powers that, let's say the curators of the narrative, they get ahead of everyone and they'll attack anybody that questions that non-negotiable premise. And they flood the zone with all this infotainment, various scenarios. They'll get you sucked into the story, basically. And then in the end, it makes me feel like you end up with a lot of different splintered camps, and you also end up with a lot of frustration and disillusionment because it's kind of like a murder mystery where people are like, oh, we're never going to get to the bottom of this. And then you're hit with the new psyop. And so Agent has done really good work on a few of these topics in particular that are just taken as non-negotiable truths, that people died in a school shooting in Texas, being one of the most recent ones, right? And then the Pulse nightclub would be another one that was in Florida, right? So with that said, I'll hand it back to you, PJ, and we'll get this conversation started on some of those topics of narrative building and control of the message, and maybe not even being able to get to whether these events are even real or not.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of good points there. And it's something that we talked about with Medicine Girl, that many times these details are put out there to really create a hamster wheel for people to be running on and be distracted. And there's always some new piece of evidence or some detail that people can get lost and not see the forest through the trees. And I've seen personally on different chat forums, and I have to admit that I've been guilty of this myself recently, that we're still talking about the Charlie Kirk op when it's over, it's done, the official history is written, and the narrative has been spun, and people have run with that narrative. Is there really any point to discussing it further? Sure, from a truth seeker standpoint, just to know exactly what was involved, I could see there's interest there. But often, as you said, they're flooding the zone with this information to keep us distracted and to keep us talking about it. And really, by talking about it, we're continuing to propel that narrative forward. And it's interesting to see how people are still chewing on it. And I'll give credit to Conspiracies. Sarah, she posted something earlier today about basically a lot of this being an intelligence test, and people are just believing these crazy, fantastical storylines, such as Charlie Kirk stopped a bullet that should have had an exit wound, and he's some sort of Superman, and that's what
Man of
happened.
Steel.
And yeah, it's true. And but at the end of the day, people are still talking about it. But I think she also made a really good point that they put these obviously dumb storylines or details in there to really check how gullible the public is, because if people are believing some of these obviously just fantastical, silly details, then they'll believe whatever you make up on the next one that's even a step further. And I think that that's a really important point. It's sort of like what happened in 2020, where everything that people changed the world's dynamic for was completely out of a screen. You didn't actually see people walking down the street falling over, even though there was some of those initial Wuhan videos that were quite comical when you look at them objectively. If people simply turned their TV off or didn't log into specific news sites, they would have never even known that there was something that was supposedly dangerous. Yet, by and large, the majority of people went for it. And then a year later, they rolled up their sleeves and took God knows what into their arm. And so, as I've said before, how you interpret those narratives and how you internalize them does have real world consequences, especially for those who had health complications after rolling their sleeves up. So, with all these narratives, and you and I had talked offline about this a little bit, they've already put a couple new ones out there for people to talk about, to digest, to react to. And at this point, I'd say that Charlie Kirk is old news, but there's still people chewing on that cud, and there's new details to get lost in. But every time the public bites on these particular narratives, it just really emboldens the powers that shouldn't be to create a new one and make it even more ridiculous. And I think that's really where we have to be cautious. And also, as you had noted, you've been making a conscious effort to pay less attention to these things. And I think that's ultimately, as I had mentioned in one of our recent broadcasts, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, did it even happen, right? So if we're not paying our attention to these new stories, then they don't really matter.
And that's kind of the conundrum in living in this world. I can think back to like primary school, elementary school, and all the kids talking about the sitcoms. Well, I didn't have access to the TV in my home. It was in my parents' bedroom, and I was like the vampire. I had to ask permission to get in, and I couldn't watch, let's say, The Cosby Show or other television programs unless I got in there. So I wasn't a TV watcher. We weren't a TV watching family, and I get to school and everyone would be talking about the latest episode of Little House on the Prairie or The Cosby Show or Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, whatever it was. And I had that FOMO of not being able to chime in. I couldn't show how cool I was because I watched. I couldn't give my insight, or I couldn't show my personality with my comments about it. And so we have that kind of dynamic going on with current events as well. And going back to our latest and greatest Substack article, Democracy is a Spectator Sport, we've somehow gotten to the point where things like public policy are way beyond just policy and legislation, and it's something we pay attention to, just like a TV show, drama. There's everything. It has the personalities, it has the fashion, like what did the first lady wear, or who's prettier, who's more handsome, things like that. And so we get sucked into these things, and it's really hard to even just sit on the sidelines when these things happen, and let alone not take a position and approach it like meditation. There's a thought. Oh, I noticed the thought. Something happened. Something didn't happen. Does it really affect me? And have that introspection and that relationship with these kinds of events. But I do sense a little bit of a crack in that black mirror going on these days, where people are definitely more conscious. And I don't think it's because we're just in this bubble, but I've made remarks out in the world, in Normie Land, about things just coming through a screen, and that's how we're receiving them. And are they really as important as they're made out to be? And I'm getting really good response from that. And I think people are kind of waking up to that. So that little facade is cracking a little bit. But as far as like, does it really matter what happened and the critical mass of belief? I don't even know, because the agendas go on, and we can see the important part of all this is how it's played out in public policy or in whatever comes next.
Yeah, great points. And it makes me think about a really excellent book that I've started reading called The 4-Hour Work Week. And it's got a lot of interesting perspectives on how to really capture your time and make time your own, and really just focus your time and attention on what matters, and to get rid of the rest. And in one particular chapter, there's a discussion of, well, you can actually save a lot of time by being intentionally ignorant of what's happening in the world. And I think he calls it intentional information ignorance. But he gives an example of how he barely looks at newspapers anymore. Mind you, this was written originally in the late 90s, early 2000s, so newspapers were still a thing there. But if he wanted to know what the narrative was, he just asked someone out in the street, what are they talking about these days? And that was enough for him. And I think that there's a lesson to be learned there, because why invest all this time and energy into something that is being published? If it's on a news site, it's got a narrative behind it. It's intentional. Do you really have to get sucked in? Do you really have to participate? I think the answer is no. And perhaps taking that in a step further, you could have that same sort of questioning of people out in the everyday public, and just determine, is this really going to affect my life? And I would say probably 9 out of 10 times it's not going to. Obviously, with something like 9/11, a bunch of radical laws were created, and then now you have restrictions in the airport and things of that nature. So in that case, yes, even if you didn't participate or give it your energy, there's a quote unquote new normal out in the world that you have to deal with. And to some extent, that was true with the 2020 op. Although now things have gone back to normal, still there are many people living with those consequences because they did participate, as I mentioned before. But in general, I know that we talked about this briefly offline, but there's some recent shootings. It's like just another op. Do I really need to spend time on it? I don't think so.
I've seen it in various videos and writing articles. People are talking about like Charlie Kirk fatigue. It's like overload. And we felt that with COVID. You can kind of feel that, all right, this op is kind of winding down. And people are just, whatever the case, whatever their position on it was, they're just ready to move on. And what is left is whatever was decided and before the op, and whether if the op got the response they wanted, whoever it is, whoever they are, or if it didn't, then they kind of modulate and we'll see the results. And right now we're seeing, I think what we're seeing is a lot of people that, if you just look at the mainstream reporting, like, why weren't there drones in the air? Why, when all these students had phones on them, what if they had like some kind of a QR code to get in and all this? And like, and parents are going to be like, well, I just want to know that my child is safe. And so they're going to have some kind of a way to scan you in and scan you out and all that. So what we're seeing is just more moves to herd people into the AI governed and regulated, the invisible prison. And I think the saddest part of it is it's a voluntary prison in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And you talking about the digital prison really makes me think about one thing that remains with us after 2020 that was part of the op, which is QR codes constantly in your face. That wasn't a thing before 2020. And now half the time you go out to eat, someone's trying to shove a QR code in your face to look at a menu, to which I always make them go find a physical one, even if it's painful. But that is definitely part of the equation. And I think that that's a really nice observation, that could be one fallout of the Charlie Kirk op, is that now there's this extra level of security that's necessary on campuses, and everyone's going to say, well, maybe it'll prevent the next shooting like Charlie Kirk, right? That so people will just readily accept that and not say, wait, why do we have to do this? So I think that that's a really good point. And I think too about the people, and we talked about this a little bit offline as well, but some of these major influencers who are out there really pushing that non-negotiable narrative, whether they look at it from a conspiracy lens or the official story, but just by virtue of them continuing to talk about it, it does cement that something did happen in people's minds. And I would say one of the chief offenders lately is Candace Owens, and there's a lot that we could say about her, but she's been given this platform to be pushing the official conspiracy theory. And that, I think, just gives, whether you accept the mainstream or the official conspiracy theory, either way, one of the fallouts is, well, we need more security at events like this. We need more surveillance. We need more digital tracking. And either side of the mainstream or official conspiracy theory may lead to that same conclusion, and people will accept that next level of tyranny or surveillance or whatever you want to call it. But the resistance is lowered by people on both sides of the official equation saying, yes, something did in fact happen, and what are we going to do about it?
I think back to even AIDS, right? And Fauci's first hoax, the big one that really put him on the map, and he was probably one of the main operators in that. And it was this virus is going around, and then it makes you want of course, the reaction, help us. The solution is AZT. They withheld AZT at first and made the so-called AIDS community, which I won't comment on the whole idea of communities based on like sexual preference or something. Like a community should be like building pole barns together, you know. But anyway, they clamored. They took to the streets and they said, "We want AZT," and they're like, "Okay, here you go." And so it's problem, reaction, solution. So I haven't quite seen just yet and one reason why is because I don't really watch the mainstream, so I'm not on the main networks, but the clamor for this security type thing. But I think collectively and cumulatively, when you have a bunch of these shootings and in a public fashion, it's definitely going to translate to a lot more concern and nervousness among parents and students. And if we just look at the way things can be expedited to really overnight change things, what's the best way? You just reprogram the next generation. So we can see a good example of the next generation being different from those that came before it, like ours and our predecessors, in terms of expectation of privacy and even awareness of privacy. They have zero expectation of privacy. They've lived their entire lives in front of computers, sharing their lives on screen, on camera, and on social media. So what's the next one? Oh, so we're chipped. So we have some kind of a full-time tracker, and we're seeing that with wearables as well. Well, okay, yeah. So Apple has my heart rate at all times, my respiration rate. How did I sleep? So we can see this push to get people to change radically through these kind of extreme events. And if you go back to the 60s, and whether it was real or not, the report from Iron Mountain, if you're familiar with that, basically said, well, you know, the peace dividend really, it's not worthwhile. We have to continue with this strategy of tension because the best way to change society is through war and through emergencies.
Great points across the board. And one thing I want to really drill down on, and it's part of a theme that I've been mentally developing and plan to expand on through the Central Texas rabbit hole, but there's all these ways out there for us to harm ourselves. And you brought up the idea of AZT being withheld to create that demand. And if you think about, you know, obviously alcohol is toxic, poisonous, bad for you in every way, but it's so readily available. But what did they do in the 1930s to make it, to ramp up the demand even more than it was for the everyday person? They created prohibition. And so prohibition itself was never meant to succeed in the way that it was positioned to the public. What it did succeed at was making people want alcohol even more and really clamor for it. And now you literally can't go anywhere out in public and not see it there available to you, right? So that's just one more way of, you could say, depopulation or population control in general. And so there is that idea that withholding something from the public that even they know on some level is not good for them creates that desire for something more dangerous or something that really ultimately is not in their best interest. And that's definitely one strategy of some of these narratives. And even thinking about 2020 and everything that was shut down and how much people wanted to get back to normal, where before that, normal for a lot of people probably looked pretty drab and painful, but just being able to get back to a situation where they didn't have a face muzzle on to get into a place seemed like a dream. And so it's really worth just kind of taking a step back on some of these things and thinking about what are they trying to take away from us or bait us into.
Maybe it's not directly related to what they're trying to bait us into, but I just touched on it, building pole barns instead of saying, well, what I like to do with my sexual identity and my sex organs makes a community, because I've linked up through social media in this artificial community, and we've got our Discord and we've got Facebook, and maybe we go out together locally and we parade with rainbow flags or something like that, and that is called a community. But what used to be a community, and what I think, there's no cheating when it comes to actual community. It's when you've suffered, you've felt things with other people, you've experienced things with people together, you've helped each other out, you've extended your hand over differences, and you've built things. You're not just going out on the street saying you oppose something or we are whatever community. And so we've been herded in our whole concept of identity, and the way I think those urges and those needs for community have been usurped, has really, it's changed the face of human behavior, so that we look for these things online and we act them out online. Meanwhile, our communities are being hollowed out, and we're giving control to things like, they literally call them community managers or city managers. These are unelected people. They're bureaucrats. And if you go to what I really think is the undergirding of Agenda 21, communitarianism, it's overlooked, but it really is the plan. And you go into the mastermind of that is named Amitai Etzioni, which is a fake name, but you can see his real identity in there because it has Zion in the middle. He was affiliated with Georgetown. I think he's gone now, but communitarianism is really the philosophy behind all of this stuff. So you have city managers, you have city planners, and even if you do believe in the voting and getting active on a local level, you're still tied into this whole kind of an umbrella of a superstructure of policy that ties into Agenda 21 and all that kind of stuff. And I think our just going online for outlets, for community, plays into all of this at the same time. So we're online, it's the platform we're using, but we're constantly trying to remind ourselves that this is not the community. This is not where lives should be lived.
Amen to that. And I think that that's also part of, you mentioned the differences in generations, and certainly the generation and generations behind us grew up with a computer or a phone in their face, and you literally can't go anywhere without them having that phone in their face. And it gets to the point where even two people out on a date have phones that they're looking at. It's like, are you there to interact with a human, or are you still stuck to this matrix device and letting it control your thoughts and the narratives that you're digesting on a daily basis? And it just does seem to be the new normal. I actually take pride myself in, at some point in the day, putting my phone far away, that I'm not even thinking about it. But that's a step too far for many. And it is unfortunate, because it's much like some of these narratives that we're talking about, and the non-negotiable narrative that is put out there intentionally to divide people, to get on some aspect of it. Was he shot? Wasn't he shot? Were there planes at 9/11? Were there not planes at 9/11? Was it demolition? Was it thermite? Was it directed energy? Again, I'm not saying that the details don't matter, but I'm saying that there's a lot of these aspects out there to divide people and get them into camps. And in a likewise manner, the digital prison actually keeps people away from interacting with people. And both details have the same net effect, which is keeping people from actually building that real human connection. And even if there's differences of opinion, it doesn't matter because you have people in real community. But if you let that division happen, then it just gives more control to the people who are pulling the puppet strings. Because if people remain divided, then they're never going to rise up and resist whatever you're peddling this particular day.
And that's a really important point about division. And it was one of the aspects that I felt I intuited immediately with the latest psyop, the CK psyop. I don't have to avoid saying his name, but it's fun. The CK situation was, okay, how is this going to be used to divide us? And one thing we've seen is just basically it's sent MAGA kind of circling the wagons, and it really made crystal clear to me that like Charlie Kirk was just an extension of Trump. And then you go to like his wife's connections to beauty pageants that were owned by Trump and all that stuff. It's like it's MAGA through and through. So it's a very, very narrow bandwidth of appeal. Well, not that narrow, but you know, it doesn't even take in like other conservatives, but it was used as a wedge. So this thing happened to them, and that made the MAGA people identifying with that as their one of the narratives that flooded the zone was the shooter aspect, and everyone is assuming he's a left winger, that kind of thing, and then that's tied into like he's got a transgender boyfriend or whatever that is. But you saw both of the traditional sides firing shots at each other, and then that how does that even end up being healed? It doesn't. It just exaggerates that rift and makes that gap yawn a bit more. And I've even felt it in my own life. I have a friend who was very affected by this whole thing, and my friend is not even able to listen to some of the ideas that are different from this non-negotiable premise that Charlie Kirk was assassinated. And I can see it even, it's not just affected this person, but it's maybe created a bit of a divide, even though we're like aligned on most things. Why do these things even have to come between us? Who cares? You're holding something in your heart. I'm holding something in my heart or my mind. And that shouldn't, it's like you like red. I like mauve, you know, like, why should that separate us? But we end up, due to human nature that's exploited, and it's really understood by Madison Avenue and Edward Bernays and the people he worked for. They're just constantly pushing our buttons. And one of the things, like you mentioned, people out on a date, they can't even look into each other's eyes. They need that dopamine hit. Oh my God, I got a notification. And I don't know where this leads. Where are we going from here other than this digital prison? But the irony about the digital prison is that it differs from a prison with four walls, because when you're in prison, you long to be free and you're in prison. But this one is invisible, and it's also like you're the one shutting the door on yourself in so many ways, so many steps in our daily lives, to be tied to this technology, to only find common ground with people who they might not even be real. They could be literal avatars. They could be bots. And in the last couple of years, they literally could be AI, just like that Joaquin Phoenix movie, Her.
And also, too, I think it's worth expanding on the thought that in these digital prisons with the younger generation behind us, that they're so used to it, they don't even know where the front door of the prison building is. In other words, they're so in that prison of their own making it's difficult for them to connect in the real world and even know how to find people in the real world and converse with them, because they're so lost in that digital prison. The thought of a front door that they can exit from is so far removed from their mind. And I think every time one of these new pieces of technology is pushed forward, it just tightens that cell door close that much further. And I brought up the QR code. That's just one example, but people readily accepted that, and now they're on to the next thing. And Lord only knows where this goes next. I agree with that sentiment. And we called this in our very early episodes, maybe even episode 1 or 2, talking about this golden age of 2025 and what were the major moves going to be. Somehow I have that feeling that the CK event will set up the next big thing for the Golden Dawn to be a hero for people, or to push some major policy change or legislation, or who knows, welcome in the false messiah that shows up in the clouds. There's so many things that could happen. We're into the fourth quarter now officially, but I'd be curious to see where everyone's bets were when we started the year in terms of when the big, like, not just ops, but like huge ops that will change the course of history were going to happen this year. Because certainly I'll be surprised if nothing major happens with all the people of the past talking about 2025. But certainly everything's been incremental. It's that turning up the temperature on the boiling pot slowly and cooking us. And no crisis is ever wasted with these ops that are put out there into the public. And I feel like everything related to CK, Trump, and all this is just really setting up the next major act of the play. What that is, I don't know, but its smell will be evident to those of us with eyes to hear and, more importantly, noses to smell.
Yes, to quote our brilliant introduction song, right? Someone's always selling it. Are you smelling it? And I take credit for the lyrics, but I'm not the lead singer on that one. Yeah. I think reading between the lies, as Peggy Hall likes to say, we can kind of see, I mean, just look at this presidency and what's going on. Just look at Trump. Early on in his administration, he might have even said it during his inauguration, that we being America, wanted to take over TikTok, right? We're going to confront the Chinese and we're going to do something about this TikTok because it's Chinese propaganda. Well, really, Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL stood up and said, we have a TikTok problem because Israel isn't popular on TikTok. And now look what happened, right? We have Trump, Larry Ellison, and his crowd taking over TikTok now, at least as far as its operations the Western facing operations go. I'm not familiar with the rest of the workings. And then we have Palantir just integrated into all of this, Peter Thiel and the funders of J.D. Vance and all these initiatives, and the Stargate that was announced the day after the inauguration. So we can see there's definitely a push towards digital ID and tracking and tracing of everything. We saw that begin with COVID and contact tracing, and getting people used to that idea and even tattling on each other, or even like in Australia, restricted zones. And so I can definitely see that kind of almost waiting for the right crisis, and maybe the CK situation move that ball down the field a lot further, actually, when depending on the spin, how this ends up kind of resolving itself in the final official story, or the solution part to the problem reaction solution. But I think we've seen it move further down the road towards just track, trace everything, the panopticon and digital ID. And we're seeing at the same time, America doesn't always get the tyranny first. we're seeing them introduce the digital ID in the UK and how that's playing out. So that could be the first step, or it could be a test case. But I think that's where I see the golden age, or whatever it is, the resolution to all this. That's where it's heading right now.
I just had this thought, and this is pure speculation. But speaking of the next big act and something that could be set up for a major event that would cause people to get in arms and demand some sort of change happening. Perhaps it's the inciting incident for having to use some sort of ID to get online, depending on how they would craft this sort of scenario. But wouldn't it be kind of interesting if CK set up the current red hair person in charge of the job being more completed than it was pre-election, if our listeners get my drift? In other words, it doesn't just hit the ear this time. Would that be the incident that causes the right to, I wouldn't say lose their mind, because I think many of them already have, or they're certainly under a strong delusion, but could that be the incident then that makes them demand even more surveillance and even more counter proposals and levels of tyranny that we never thought possible? I wouldn't take that out of the equation, and it certainly seems that JD Vance has been groomed to be the next president at some point. So wouldn't it just be perfect timing for something to happen before the close of the year, that there's a major political event like that that really just gets the people asking for the solution after the big problem?
That's a really good speculation, and I've definitely heard there's kind of like an undercurrent of a little bit of, I'm not in chat rooms where there's chatter, but you know what I mean, an ambient kind of a buzz that there might be something that goes beyond grazing an ear in a Kabbalistic ritual, which is, maybe we can talk about that in a show another time, but that's my take on that one, the Iwo Jima situation. And I think you're right that what we've been seeing is this, with this divide, this left-right divide, the MAGA and versus progressive kind of divide, the Trump-Biden divide. We're seeing people who, a few years ago, if somebody censored Tucker, let's say, they'd be freaking out. But when somebody goes ahead and censors Jimmy Kimmel or Colbert, they're on board for that. They're on board for canceling people, where a few years ago, they were the ones that had principles, and they would even say, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I will defend your right to say it with my life, because free speech is that important. And we're seeing not just what we already mentioned, the erosion of privacy, but we're even seeing the erosion of respect for and expectation of free speech. And where is that going to lead? And I think you also touched on another thing. I think we very likely have almost gotten there as well, which is a single ID to get on the internet. And no more anonymity. I can't be Discerning Jake anymore. You can't be PJ Warren anymore. And a lot more serious issues and we're seeing it with this 2-step authentication for everything. When you try and watch YouTube on your TV, now they want you to scan a QR code so it ties into your phone, so you can't just be an anonymous receiver of YouTube on your television anymore. It's tied into your phone. So we're seeing everything getting to where essentially you're going to have to be licensed to get online and verified.
Yeah, what would they call that? Shadow censoring, perhaps? It's frightening to think about, and I do think it would take something as extreme as what I had speculated just now to get a large majority of the population on board with requiring another layer of surveillance, another layer of tracking and tracing that could potentially be an outcome, and certainly there could be even bigger moves at hand, but that one seems almost too obvious, and I feel like the script writers already have that as at least one option for the next op. It's likely sitting in a drawer somewhere, and they're just deciding which one will make the most sense. But I just have this feeling that something is coming before the close of the year. I don't know what, but I'm just picking the obvious one, that CK begets another similar incident, but I suppose time will tell.
It will indeed, and it could also come in the form of some kind of an economic crisis where the government steps in to give aid to people, and you can only get that if you have a certain type of ID, like they did with Real ID. You can't do certain things, or it's a lot harder to do certain things without Real ID. It's not impossible at this point, but so we could. I really hope, I desperately hope that it's just more theater, whatever the case is, that it's some role, some character like a Charlie Kirk, like a Donald Trump that is retired, that the character is retired, rather than something that causes mass devastation and hardship, and that makes people beg for a solution to put them in that digital prison. So that's my prayer for today, is just keep up with the fakery. Don't stop affecting people's lives on such a real level, and cause such real pain. But we know they're not beyond trying to do that.
Yeah, and I agree. It's probably the call to action for this week is just to focus your time and energy elsewhere that could be a lot more productive than biting on these ops that come our way and talking about all the various details related to everything that's in the storyline, whether believable or not, because what else could we be doing with our time? And the answer is a lot. There's so many things that we can do to impact the world, and being lost in the latest shooting or lost in some new character they introduce is simply just not a good use of the limited time that we have in this life. And as someone who has a very deep knowledge of the insurance industry, I've seen it firsthand that no one is guaranteed tomorrow. And don't live your life as though you've got 50 more years or whatever the case may be, because tomorrow may never come. And do you really want to spend your last hours on CK and his fake character wife and all of that? I would say no, there's better uses of time and energy.
Very well said. And I think one of these days we're going to have a show on something like digital detox and ways to practice what we're getting at in a lot of these things, and in a lot of our topics, because that keeps coming up. And where you pay your attention really does matter. We constantly talk about that. Just think of all the lost time and all the lost energy and all those emotions that might be directed towards the other side that we've been focused on for so long, and what you could have done with that time and energy if you weren't doing that. And even if it's just sitting still and listening to your heartbeat, your breath, and nature. That's something we've lost with our constant checking on our phones and checking our computers and answering all the texts that come constantly, where people expect you to get back immediately, or otherwise you're ghosting them. We've lost those in-between moments where you're alone with your thoughts. And don't be afraid of those moments. Just embrace them, enjoy them. Maybe write some song lyrics for some really cool AI tunes while you're doing that.
Here, here. I think this is a perfect wrapping up point for this week's episode. I couldn't agree more with everything you just said. And Yeah, just think about all the things that are possible in life. And I think one advantage to the new direction I've taken and what I'm doing on a daily basis is the real need for development and reading books and really expanding how you think about the world and how you think about serving others. And that's really the key for what I do in my quote unquote professional life is serving others. And I'll just recommend a book. I know this is out of the blue, but one that's really been inspiring me lately is called Chase the Lion. Very good book. The tagline for that book is, if your dreams don't scare you, you're thinking too small. So I would definitely recommend that book. And I guess maybe we can close on, Jake, what are you reading these days?
This is not quite a self-improvement book or something to reflect on where you fit in the world. It's Weird Scenes from the Canyon, and it's by Dave McGowan, and it's about Laurel Canyon and all the characters that came out of that area near LA. And just if you're not familiar with Dave McGowan, check out his work. It's absolutely outstanding, and that ties into another book that he wrote called Program to Kill. And just a plug for Dave McGowan, he's not here with us anymore, but his daughter maintains a site called Center for an Informed America. And if you're curious about things like the moon, so-called moon landings, there's a really great series called Wagging the Moon Doggy. And there's even a series on Laurel Canyon. I think he might have used that as kind of a first draft for the book. So you check that out as a little teaser. That's what I'm reading right now, and it's fabulous.
That's all we have for this week, but it's been a really great discussion. Before we wrap up, I just would say to our audience, we'd love to hear what you're reading. Put some of your favorites in the comments. I've been stacking up books, but I'd love to stack a few more. Tell us what's really inspiring you. But with that, we're looking to have some more guests on in the near future, and hopefully we'll have some new faces and new perspectives. So until then, stay tuned.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.